Discussing more advanced prostate cancer, and we thought it was very important, which is also relevant to every stage of prostate cancer, to really discuss a little bit about clinical trials, what they actually mean, sort of what the benefits and drawbacks are. And we're very fortunate enough also to have several patients, several men who have been involved in clinical trials. So Dr. Bruce Montgomery will lead off this session. Bruce is a professor of medicine in medical oncology at the University of Washington. He's a real clinical leader nationally and internationally in bringing new therapies in prostate cancer to bear. So he's going to talk, give you an introduction to the clinical trials, and then lead the roundtable discussion, and we'll be able to take some questions from you as well. Bruce?
Thanks, Pete. This is a real pleasure for me, because I think, we talk about clinical trials in very general terms a lot of the time, but I think that this is where the rubber hits the road. We talk about all the spectacular basic research that we do at the Hutchinson and the UW, which is great in and of itself. But the idea is that if that does not translate into something that impacts on a patient's care, that work is not really as important, or we're not really taking advantage of it in a way that is, let's just say, as useful as it might be. So we do tend to talk about clinical studies in the context of interventions, meaning testing new drugs, doing, having people come to the clinic and give them things. There are actually many different types of clinical research. So some of what I have up on the slide is basically it's human research looking at using things like what are called biomarkers. So you heard a little bit about that from Dr. Schweitzer. So looking at things that are indicators of likelihood of response or not that can help us to make decisions about treatment. That's circulating tumor DNA, that can be splice variants, it can be any number of things. And you're actually going to hear from Dr. Pritchard very soon, who's going to be talking about how looking in tissue can give you insights as to what the next therapy might be. And again, that's biomarker research. So intervention is what we classically think of, and I'm going to touch on that mostly over the next few minutes. And that's testing new treatments at different stages in men dealing with prostate cancer. And then there's also looking at things like outcomes. How do our therapies affect people's quality of life? That isn't always called out very specifically in the clinical studies that we do, but it's obviously just as important, if not more important, than how effective it is in terms of controlling the disease. So quality of life is also a big part of clinical research. So when we talk about phases of clinical research, it gets very complicated, I would say. I would say that the first part of clinical research is the preclinical part, right? So again, we were talking about the spectacular basic research that happens here at the Hutchinson and at the University of Washington. And this is work that is done sometimes in cell lines, sometimes in animal models, sometimes just in tissue that has been collected from patients, and we're looking for new things, which can then lead to the next study. So this always precedes something that is done in a human. So we aren't doing this without a lot of very significant work that goes into designing these clinical studies. So phase one is what's called essentially dose testing. You have a drug that oftentimes has not been given to any humans before, and we're giving it to somebody with the idea that it makes sense in terms of treating the disease, but we need to decide what dose is safe. And that's usually doing things like giving it to people and seeing what their side effects are, also looking at what the blood levels are of the drug to say, are we or are we not getting enough drug into the system to have an effect on the tissue, because you cannot really predict what the blood levels will be very easily. I think you heard from Dr. Schweitzer earlier about this drug niclosamide that he's giving orally, which is not the way it's typically been done. And so he's been looking at how we can get enough of that drug into the bloodstream. So these are small studies in a small number of patients, and we're being very careful, a lot of evaluations, stepping through this process. Phase two is where we do a lot of our work. So we decide that a drug is safe at a specific dose, and there oftentimes is some clear evidence of response. It's pretty rare, definitely in industry studies, sometimes in our studies, that they will not take a drug further past phase one if there really isn't a significant amount of evidence that it's effective, right? Which makes sense. giving a drug to somebody, even though it's well tolerated, it doesn't really make a great deal of sense to anybody if it's not going to work. It's not just taking one drug and then putting it into a larger group of patients to see how effective it is. This is also the space in which we often combine drugs that have not been put together before. And again, I think you heard Dr. Schweitzer describing some of the studies that Dr. Cheng is doing in patients with DNA repair defects. So combining things like docetaxel and carboplatin in patients, that's a phase 2 study. Those drugs have been used for many years by themselves, not necessarily together. So phase 3, I guess that's that. I'll just use my hands. Yeah, so there are actually obviously other screens. So phase 3, it doesn't like phase 3. So a phase 3 study is where we take a drug that has clearly shown activity and we think it might be an improvement on what is a standard of care in a very specific situation. So I'm going to walk through a specific drug that has been a success story and show you what that means, but it's usually randomized, so the physicians and the patients don't really have a choice of which of these therapies they get, but at a minimum they are getting what is the standard of care, and then there is the possibility of getting the experimental agent with the idea of that potentially being more benefit. And then phase 4 is where it's already been FDA approved and we're really tracking toxicity in a much larger population of patients to make sure that we didn't miss something in terms of toxicity later. So I'm going to talk about Abiraterone because this is a drug also called Zytiga that is a success story and sort of how these steps evolved and evolved very quickly. When a drug is good, things happen very rapidly. So I'm not going to show you all the details of what all these graphs mean. I'm going to sort of give you the 10,000-foot view. So this was a study that was done in around 2004 by a urologist who said, you know, I've been doing TURPs in men with advanced prostate cancer that are on hormone therapy, but when I look at the tissue, the hormone levels are the same as they are in somebody who hasn't been on hormone therapy. Why is that, right? So that was unexpected. And so we actually did some work, a number of the people you've heard from and are going to hear from did some work looking in patients, and in fact showed that in some tissues, the hormone levels in a man who has no circulating testosterone were up to 5 times higher than they were in a man who did have a normal androgen axis, which says there's something happening in the tissue that is regulating hormonal production that nobody expected. And that really led to the idea that, you know, hormones remain important, even what used to be called hormone refractory disease, and that we needed to hit the process of hormone production more effectively. And a group in the UK pulled a drug off the shelf that had been sitting around for 10 years that did, in fact, affect hormone production. They did a phase 1-2 study in a very short period of time, showed that in men who had resistant disease, the response rate was somewhere in the range of about 60%. And then a series of the fastest randomized studies in prostate cancer were done, each of them with over 1,000 patients. And they showed that in men who had or had not had chemotherapy, the drugs had benefit in terms of improving response and survival. Okay? And this actually happened over the course of somewhere in the range of about 7 years. Okay? Now that sounds like a long time, but in drug development, you know, the drug studies really were completed. The first phase 1-2 were completed in about 2008 to FDA approval in 2011. That is a land speed record. Okay? So there have been other drugs like that, but this is an example. In these phase 3 studies, what was done was the standard of care was used as the comparator to Abiraterone in this case, and again showed real benefits. So we're going to talk about pros and cons of participating in clinical research, but having access to a drug like this is one of the reasons why we think participating in research is a good idea for patients. So the next steps, we've been participating in a number of studies that have said, so how can we double down on this? So one thing that you do with an effective drug in advanced disease is you move it earlier in the process. You try to look at how effective that might be in patients who have localized disease. Can you get rid of the cancer? So we've been doing studies using Abiraterone prior to surgery and looking at how much cancer is left behind at the time of surgery to see how we might improve outcomes. We've also done the same thing in men getting radiation therapy, combining Abiraterone with radiation to look at outcomes. And in fact, in that study, things looked very good. So then the next steps, which you're going to hear a little bit from some of the men who have participated in this study, was to look at how we might improve on abiraterone by looking at what happens in the tissue in men undergoing therapy with either abiraterone or enzalutamide. And this is a study that we participated in and continue to participate in, and you'll hear a little bit more about sort of what that has meant. I hope Dr. Pritchard may be able to speak to that because he played a big role here. But the idea is that we just keep doubling down. We keep looking for new ways in which we can improve our outcomes even when a drug is very effective. So what are the pros and cons to participating in a research study? So I think the possible benefits you've heard I've touched on before, that is, you can't get a drug. For example, abiraterone was not available outside of a clinical study at the time that these studies that I had up on the board were being done. So access to a drug that's otherwise not available and might be the next great thing only happens through a clinical study. The second part is when you're on a study, many people are paying attention to what happens to you. Now we know that in fact patients who participate in clinical studies generally do better than people who do not. That's due to a lot of different things. People who participate in studies tend to be more motivated. They tend to be very careful about what they're doing. They also are being cared for at academic centers of excellence. So you can't completely remove those facets and aspects of care from being on the study. But they're all wrapped into one bundle, and so in general, people who do participate in studies do better. Then finally, and you'll hear about this from the men that we're going to have up here and who are going to very generously share their stories, is sort of the greater good. Men are dealing with prostate cancer. They don't want men in 20 years to be dealing with it in the same way that they're dealing with it today. So the idea of improving care for the future generations of men who may have to deal with prostate cancer is a very big motivation for many people. Now, what are the downsides? So it wouldn't be research if we knew everything about the drug. So harms and the relative benefits, we don't know. Okay, we don't know that the therapy will be better than the standard of care, but obviously we wouldn't do it if we didn't think it was possible. It almost always means that you have to make more visits to the clinic than you would be if you were on standard of care therapy. And again, the reason for that is there's a very clear plan as to how these studies go on, and I think Mr. Thompson, who's one of the folks who's going to speak, will touch on that. But it can be a commitment in time. And then some insurance doesn't cover study costs. I mean, most of them do, and we do actually check as to whether insurance is going to cover your participation in a clinical study, but not everybody's insurance will cover those costs, and that is definitely a downside. So I know that's been a very brief discussion of clinical studies, and I think, again, we're going to hear from some folks who have participated in clinical research in just a moment, so hopefully their personal experience will sort of flesh this all out for you. I think finding clinical studies if people are interested, and again, it can be any of these different types that I talked about, biomarker, outcomes, or intervention. Clinicaltrials.gov is an NCI-sponsored clinical trial website. It's a little complicated to walk through, but it actually is a very good tool to finding clinical research studies. The local ones that we have at our site are on the main website, the SCCA, Seattle Cancer Care Alliance website. If you go to Diseases and Treatments, prostate cancer, and then on the left side of the page, clinical trials is one of the headings. It opens up all the studies that are actually open at the institution. And right now we have 21 different studies that are available for participation. So you can never say this enough. The only way that we make progress is by doing research. I know that many people have sort of mixed feelings about it. The whole idea of participating when we don't absolutely know that something's going to be beneficial, it takes a leap of faith. On the other hand, we're not going to improve therapy for you or the people to come without participation in research. And it's worthwhile emphasizing what kind of a role the IPCR, this organization, plays locally, because the funds that they provide to support local research is so much more useful in many ways than the National Cancer Institute or some of these large foundations, because it takes oftentimes a year to get the money from an institution, even if they actually do approve funding. And the way things are changing these days, an idea you have today is irrelevant in a year. So IPCR has actually made it possible. I think you heard from Dr. Cheng earlier in the day. She's doing some very exciting work that's actually being supported by a number of people in the room. And I just want to emphasize how important IPCR has been to that effort and thank them. So now we're actually going to have two men come up who have participated in clinical research, and I'm hoping that Mr. Thompson and Mr. Atkinson